What drives a man to murder his pregnant wife and unborn child? The case of Scott Peterson has haunted us for years, leaving behind a trail of questions that still linger in the minds of those who followed it. How did a seemingly normal husband become the face of one of the most infamous crimes in American history? It was Christmas Eve, 2002, a day that should have been filled with joy and anticipation, as Lacey Peterson, who was 8 months pregnant, prepared to celebrate the holiday with her family. You can imagine the excitement in the air. Christmas is just around the corner. A new baby is on the way and the warmth of family gatherings. But instead of decking the halls and wrapping presents, Lacey was nowhere to be found. Her husband, Scott Peterson, would later tell the police that when he returned home from a solo fishing trip that afternoon, Lacey had simply vanished. No goodbye note, no sign of struggle, just an empty house where the Christmas cheer was supposed to be. Now, here's where things start to get strange. Scott claimed that he had planned to spend the day golfing, something he did often. But, according to him, the weather was too cold that morning, so he made a last-minute decision to go fishing instead. This wasn't just a casual outing. He drove out to the Berkeley Marina, launched his boat, and spent several hours on the water. When you first hear this, it sounds innocent enough, right? A guy just trying to enjoy some time on the water. But when you dig a little deeper, the whole thing starts to feel off. For one, it was December in Northern California, not prime boating weather. Scott said it was too cold to golf, yet he thought it was a good idea to sit in an open boat on the freezing waters of the San Francisco Bay. And then there's the fact that Scott wasn't exactly known for being an avid fisherman. This wasn't a regular pastime for him. It was out of character. Even more suspicious is the fact that Lacey, who was just weeks away from giving birth, had no clue that Scott planned to go boating that day. Think about that for a second. Your wife is 8 months pregnant, and you decide to take off for a day on the water without so much as mentioning it to her. It's weird, to say the least. You know how sometimes, when things seem too good to be true, they usually are. That's exactly what happened when Amber Frey stepped into the spotlight in January 2003. Amber was a 27-year-old massage therapist who, like many of us, was just trying to find love and happiness. She thought she had found that in Scott Peterson, a charming and seemingly unattached man who swept her off her feet. What she didn't know, what none of us knew at the time, was that Scott was already married to Lacey Peterson. And not just married, he was the husband of a missing, pregnant woman who had become the focus of a nationwide search. When Amber came forward, it was like a bomb going off in the middle of an already tense situation. She revealed that she had been having an affair with Scott, completely unaware that he was married, let alone that his wife was missing. Imagine the shock. This revelation didn't just change the way people viewed Scott. It blew the whole case wide open. Suddenly, Scott wasn't just a grieving husband. He was a man with a very dark secret, a secret that could explain everything. Public opinion turned against him in an instant. People started asking themselves, if he could lie so easily to his mistress, what else is he hiding? Amber didn't just walk away after discovering the truth. No, she did something incredibly brave. She decided to work with the police to help them catch Scott and his lies. She recorded her conversations with him, capturing every word as he tried to maintain his web of deceit. And let me tell you, these recordings were damning. They weren't just casual chats. They were the smoking gun that proved Scott was hiding something big. One of the most chilling moments was during a vigil held for Lacey, where friends and family gathered to pray for her safe return. While everyone else was heartbroken and desperate for answers, Scott was on the phone with Amber, pretending to be thousands of miles away in Europe. That's right. He told her he was on a business trip, completely fabricating an alibi while standing in the middle of a vigil for his missing wife. It's almost too twisted to believe, but it's true. He was trying to keep up the charade with Amber, all while knowing full well that Lacey and their unborn son were never coming home. As more of these recorded calls came to light, Scott's lies began to collapse like a house of cards. It became clear that he wasn't just a man caught in a difficult situation. He was a cold, calculating individual who was willing to deceive everyone around him to protect his own skin. The fact that he continued to lie, even as the walls were closing in on him, only made him look more guilty in the eyes of the public and the authorities. In April 2003, after months of agonizing uncertainty, the search for Lacey Peterson came to a horrifying end. The bodies of Lacey and her unborn son, Connor, were found washed up on the shore near where Scott had gone fishing that fateful Christmas Eve. I remember when this news broke. It was like a collective gasp swept across the nation. We all hoped for a different outcome, but deep down, many of us feared the worst. And what was found was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Lacey's body was in a state of advanced decomposition, almost unrecognizable after being submerged in the water for months. The once vibrant woman was reduced to a grim shell, partially consumed by marine life. The gruesome reality of what happens to a body in the water for so long was laid bare. Saltwater, tides, and creatures of the sea had all taken their toll, leaving behind something that barely resembled the person she once was. It's hard to even think about the agony her family must have felt when they learned how her body was found. But if Lacey's condition was horrifying, Connor's was even more gut-wrenching. His tiny body had been expelled from Lacey's womb due to the natural process that occurs post-mortem. And there he was, lifeless and still. The most chilling detail: the tape was found wrapped around his neck. It's one of those images that stays with you, haunting and inexplicable. What kind of monster could do that to an unborn child? That tape became one of the most disturbing symbols of this entire case. Even with the bodies found, the question remained: how did they end up in the bay? And why were they there in the first place? This is where the pieces of the puzzle started to come together, and all eyes turned to Scott. You see, from the beginning, Scott claimed he had been out fishing at the Berkeley Marina on the day Lacey disappeared. Now, with her body washing up just a few miles from where he said he was, it wasn't a stretch to connect the dots. The police were working with circumstantial evidence, but it was damning. One of the most suspicious details was the cement anchors Scott had made. These weren't your run-of-the-mill anchors. They were homemade, and there were several of them. But when investigators searched Scott's boat, they only found one. The others, well, they were missing. And the logical conclusion was that they were used to weigh down Lacey's body in the bay. It's a chilling thought, but it fits with everything else that had come to light. Then there was the hair, Lacey's hair, found on a pair of pliers in Scott's boat. Some might argue that it wasn't unusual for her hair to be there. After all, they lived together. Investigators began to believe that Scott had meticulously planned this, weighing down Lacey's body with the anchors to keep it submerged, hoping it would never be found. The trial of Scott Peterson, which began in June 2004, was nothing short of a media circus. If you were around back then, you probably remember how it dominated the news day in and day out. It was like the whole nation was glued to their TVs, waiting for the next bombshell to drop. This wasn't just another courtroom drama. It was a spectacle that captivated millions. People were obsessed with every detail, from the evidence presented to the expressions on Scott's face as he sat in the defendant's chair. It felt like everyone had an opinion about whether Scott was guilty or innocent, and the trial became the ultimate test of that. But let's not forget how challenging this trial was for the prosecution. They didn't have a confession. Scott never admitted to anything. There was no clear cause of death for Lacey or Connor. The bodies were so badly decomposed that determining exactly how they died was impossible. And then there was the glaring absence of a murder weapon. In most murder cases, that's a huge hurdle to overcome. So, how did the prosecution manage to build a case strong enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt? The answer lies in the mountain of circumstantial evidence they presented. Sure, they didn't have direct proof, but they had a lot of little things that, when put together, painted a pretty damning picture of Scott. They highlighted how Scott's story didn't add up: the suspicious fishing trip, the missing cement anchors, the lies to Amber Frey, and most importantly, how Lacey's body was found exactly where Scott claimed to have been on the day she disappeared. It was all about connecting the dots, and while any one piece of evidence might not have been enough on its own, together, they formed a narrative that was hard to ignore. The defense, of course, had a different story to tell. They argued that Scott was being unfairly targeted because of his affair with Amber Frey. According to them, Scott wasn't a killer. He was just a man who made some bad decisions, like cheating on his wife, but that didn't mean he was capable of murder. They even floated the idea that Lacey had been kidnapped by burglars who were working across the street from the Peterson home. The defense suggested that Lacey might have confronted these burglars, leading to her abduction and murder. It was a plausible theory, especially considering there were no witnesses to the crime and no concrete evidence of how it happened. But the defense's arguments started to crumble when Amber Frey took the stand. Her testimony was a turning point in the trial. She wasn't just some side character in Scott's life. She was the person who exposed his double life, and her words carried weight. Amber told the court how Scott had lied to her about being a widower, how he continued the affair even as the search for Lacey was underway, and how he showed no signs of grief or worry about his missing wife and unborn son. The jury listened to the recordings of Scott's calls with Amber, and those calls were chilling. When the jury finally delivered their verdict in the case against Scott Peterson, it felt like the culmination of a saga that had gripped the entire country. After 6 long months of testimony, arguments, and emotional appeals, the jury found Scott guilty of first-degree murder for the death of his wife, Lacey, and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son, Connor. The room was tense. the air thick with anticipation, and when the words "guilty" were spoken, it was as if a collective breath was released across the nation. Many people felt a sense of justice, a belief that the system had worked, and that the man responsible for such a heinous crime would finally pay the price. Scott's sentencing was equally dramatic. He was sentenced to death, a decision that was as much a reflection of the brutality of the crime as it was of public outrage. Lassie and Connor had been taken in the most violent, cruel way possible, and for many, the death penalty seemed like the only fitting punishment. But that's not to say the verdict was without controversy. Some believed that the evidence was too circumstantial, that the lack of a clear cause of death and a murder weapon left too much room for doubt. They argued that Scott was being punished more for his infidelity and his cold demeanor than for any definitive proof of murder. But despite these arguments, the jury's decision stood, and Scott was sent to death row. However, the story didn't end there. Fast forward to 2020, nearly 2 decades after the murders, and Scott Peterson's death sentence was overturned by the California Supreme Court. The reason? Problems with the jury selection process. It turns out that the trial judge had dismissed potential jurors who expressed general opposition to the death penalty without properly questioning them about whether they could set aside their views and still consider it as a sentencing option. This might seem like a technicality, but in a case as high profile as this, every detail matters. The court ruled that Scott had not received a fair sentencing hearing, and his death sentence was vacated. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The issue of jury misconduct didn't stop with the death penalty. Allegations surfaced that one of the jurors had lied during the jury selection process. This juror, it was claimed, had failed to disclose that she had been a victim of domestic violence and had sought a restraining order while pregnant. Details that could have shown bias or an inability to be impartial. If this misconduct is proven, it could lead to Scott Peterson being granted a whole new trial, throwing the entire case back into the spotlight and reopening wounds that had never fully healed. Imagine that. A man who was once sentenced to death, who the world had all but written off as a convicted murderer, could potentially walk free if a new trial finds him not guilty. The legal battles are still ongoing, and as of now, it's unclear what the future holds for Scott Peterson. Will he be retried and reconvicted? Or will the cracks in the original case be enough to cast doubt on his guilt? It's a chilling thought, especially for the families of Lacey and Connor, who have been through so much already. In the end, the case of Scott Peterson is far from closed. It's a story that continues to evolve, with new twists and turns that keep us all wondering what happened that Christmas Eve in 2002. And as the legal drama plays out, one thing is certain: the question of Scott Peterson's guilt and the justice for Lacey and Connor will remain a topic of intense debate for years to come. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.